All right, welcome everybody to episode 91 of the Inglorious Bastards campaign. I have a very, very special guest tonight. We have done all kinds of great interviews with this second part of the campaign, Rise of the Mormogil. We've had language experts, we've had professors, multiple professors in fact. And I am just so excited to introduce somebody tonight. Tonight, the topic is going to be mapping and cartography and atlases and all the wonderfulness that goes along with that. And of course, when you talk about Tolkien and you're talking about atlases and cartography, you have to talk about the Atlas of Middle-earth by Karen Wynn Fonstad. And I have the privilege tonight to talk to her son, Mark. So welcome to the podcast.
Good day.
So I think we should just start. We should get right into this. Does that sound good?
Sounds good. Okay. Thank you for inviting me.
Oh, thank you. So I guess the first question I would have would be, kind of like an introductory question. Give people a little bit of a background on who you are, who your mother was, where you guys are from, that sort of thing.
Certainly. My name is Mark Fonstad, and I'm a professor of geography at the University of Oregon. My mother was Karen Wynn Fonstad, and she was amongst other things, a cartographer who occasionally taught at the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And my father was a professor of geography who taught also at that same university, the University of Wisconsin-Oshkosh. And my mother was from Oklahoma, and she did a master's degree in geography at the University of Oklahoma, which is where she met my father. He's from Wisconsin, she's from Oklahoma, so I have family from both of those. And she was there actually originally to be an art major. And but you have to recognize in the 60s, that was a time of sort of abstract art. Mm-hmm. And she really didn't feel like the kind of art that she liked, she didn't really fit in at that time. And so somebody encouraged her to get involved with medical art, which at the time was all done by hand. Mm-hmm. And at some point, somebody told her, well, if you're going to do medical art, you need to have some medical training. And so she went and became a physical therapy student. And she actually did physical therapy for quite a while during her life when she wasn't doing cartography. But even that, it didn't exactly work out. And she ended up doing mapping for somebody who needed it done at the university. And eventually somebody said, why don't you just get a degree in geography? That's where they're doing mapping. And so that's how she ended up as a cartography student. And that would have been in the late 1960s. And she was a graduate student, a master's student in the late 60s at roughly the time when The Lord of the Rings was very much in vogue. This is the sort of late 60s social upheaval, and that was a time when there was an enormous interest in Tolkien. Of course, he was still alive at that time. Right. And she had never read any of those books at the time, but she had a student who was trying to make a class map of Lord of the Rings, and I think the student wasn't very good. I don't think they actually even finished their map for class, but that was the first time she had ever heard of it. And a little while later, she was at a friend's house, and they had the very first book of the Lord of the Rings, The Fellowship of the Ring. Yeah. And they offered it to her. She took it home and read the whole thing in one night.
Wow.
And of course didn't have the other two books, and the library wasn't open, and so she had to sit and wait for days. But in the next few years, I think she must have read that trilogy 50 times, which is of course exactly what you have to do if you're going to make an atlas. Right.
Well, that's pretty impressive. I think the first time I read The Fellowship of the Ring, I don't know that I made it past Tom Bombadil without putting it down for a few days.
In many ways, the first book is the hardest.
Yes.
There's like many books. We have to put a lot of there's a lot of just introductory material you have to start with, plus there are sort of side stories in the first book that are not exactly central, and so it is hard for some people. Just imagine if you had started with the Silmarillion, though, and it's not that hard.
Yes, absolutely. And I had the same reaction at first to the Ainulindale first chapter of the Silmarillion, but now it's my absolute favorite. So this is really interesting stuff. I had no idea that any of these things really about your mother. So you have three sort of geography centered people in your family: yourself, your father, and your mother. So did your mother pass down this love of maps and cartography and atlases to you, or how did that happen?
That's a good question. I think, well, when you're around two geographers, it's like being around two actors or two musicians or something. Even if you're not interested in it, you get to be pretty good at it. And we did a lot of being outdoors and traveling around and being worldly, and I think I was sort of destined, at least myself, to being a geographer. I did try to do other things, but eventually I was back in geography. Did she pass that love down? Her love down? Well, I suppose certainly I got a lot out of it, or I got a lot of her growing up, and I still do.
Yeah. Did she pass down that love of Tolkien and fantasy to you as well?
Yeah, I think she read it to me when I was a kid. And of course, the first edition of the Atlas was being made 1979, 1980. And I was about, 7 or 8 years old. And too young to really understand entirely what was going on, but I knew what was going on, and I certainly knew the stories, at least generally at that point. And when the revision was being done, I was in high school, and I knew exactly what was going on, and I had read probably all the books at that time that existed. Not all of them exist. Not all the history volumes had been released at that point.
Right.
So I very much knew about them, and I was very interested. So yeah, I suppose even today I have an interest in fantasy, although I tend to have to read a lot of other stuff instead of every night doing fantasy. I was very much a fan of Ursula Le Guin, and she just died, of course, earlier this year.
Yeah.
She's from Portland, Oregon, and I was lucky enough to see her several times. So I suppose it's still continued.
Oh wow! Yeah, I know. So I just to give people a little bit of a context here. So I believe the first Atlas, the first version of the Atlas, came out in 1981.
That's right.
I think that was the first publication date. And just for context, I believe the Silmarillion came out in 1977, if I'm not mistaken. And the copy of the this must be it's titled the revised edition. I have this beautiful paperback copy of your mother's book here, and this one was released, I believe, in 1991. If I'm not
1991.
Yeah. And it's gorgeous. But in the intervening years, the 10 years between the first publication and this revised edition, I believe Christopher Tolkien had released the History of Middle-earth series. Is that correct?
He had released some of the history series, not all of them, and the Unfinished Tales had also been released in the meantime.
Right.
When the original Atlas was done, none of those things existed, although my mother had been told that they were coming. All she had was The Lord of the Rings, The Hobbit, and The Silmarillion. And in fact, the idea for doing an atlas didn't exist before the Silmarillion, because for the first couple of years that she had an interest in Tolkien, and as a cartographer she was interested in the maps, she really was thinking about making an enormous map, an indexed map like you'd see on somebody's wall. But the more she thought about it, the more complex she realized such a map would have to be to include everything that was of interest to people. And then when the Silmarillion came out, my father knew that my mother was interested in it. He actually went down to the store and bought it for her. Oh. And she read it straight through, and she realized pretty quickly that it would have been impossible to put all of that, as well as the other the other stories on a map. So it was at that moment she thought, okay, well, that's why we have atlases. Right. And that's when the idea of the atlas arose. So that was, I can't remember exactly when the Silmarillion came out, 1976 or
77, I believe.
77. Yep. And so very quickly she thought about, well, what do I do? Do I call it the Tolkien estate? Do I go to an editor? What do I do? And a friend of hers who... She had author friends around and people who had worked with publishers. And somebody said, you know, these groups, the publishers and the Tolkien estate, they probably get 1,000 suggestions every year. And it's very tough to get a foot in the door that way. Why don't you find out who is actually doing the publishing and call them directly and say, here's an idea, and do you have a specialist? And so I think at that time the publisher was Houghton Mifflin.
It is, yeah.
And she called them, and they had a woman whose name I can't remember, but who had actually worked with Professor Tolkien, and she talked to this woman and said, "This is the idea. I've got cartography background. I've done a lot of annotations of the books, cartographic annotations, and this is the plan. This is what I would like to do." And the woman said something to the effect of, you know, we get 100 terrible ideas a year on things that are Tolkien related, but this actually sounds different and very interesting. And very quickly, and this woman went to the Tolkien estate. And so my mother never went to the Tolkien estate. She went to the publisher.
Got it.
And that was the way that she was able to, very quickly they said yes. And she was on her way. There were a couple of other things that happened that were important. The first is that I don't know how she knew, somebody must have told her that the Marquette University had Tolkien holdings. And so pretty quickly, so we lived maybe 90 miles away from Milwaukee, which is where those materials were held. And she went down many times to look through them, and she actually discovered one or two maps, images that no one had seen before. They had been misindexed, and so it was very useful to her to be able to have access to those materials. And it's funny, some of the materials are just exactly what you would expect a professor would have, like those little blue books, for example, that you would take tests with. Those are, many of the things he wrote were in those kind of books. So that was very helpful. Wow, that's incredible. And you said these were housed sort of near where you were from. That's right. So we lived in Oshkosh, Wisconsin, which is sort of east central Wisconsin. And the Tolkien Library, I can't remember exactly what it's called, the collection is at Marquette University, which is in Milwaukee, which is also in Wisconsin, in southeastern Wisconsin. And so that was very useful. She didn't have to drive 1,000 miles to see those materials. Yeah. Oh, wow. Well, so she started working on this. You said she started in around 79, and it took her about... It would have been... Yeah, roughly late 78, 79, somewhere in there. And so it took her two and a half years to produce. Of course, at that time, there were no personal computers, or there were personal computers, but they didn't have any means to make production quality maps. So everything was done by hand. All the maps were done by hand. They were penciled and inked, and there weren't even the copiers that we have today, the enlarging, reducing copiers. It all had to be done by hand. Pretty quickly, we did buy, my family bought a early Apple PC because she had to do the writing part of it. When you do a comprehensive atlas, you can't just make maps. Of course, there's a lot of text. And at the time, like Microsoft Word didn't even exist. There were early predecessors. So it was much more like writing computer code to get things to come out just the way you want. So she was very driven. And a lot of that work was very late at night. She was a night owl. She passed that on to me. I'm a night owl. And so she would be working into the night at home on a light table, a drafting table, and it was sort of my father's job in the morning to get his kids up and get them to school, because there was just no way that she was going to be able to do that in the morning and also work at night.
Wow. That's a great story. I wanted to read a piece here from the acknowledgments, or I can just kind of mention what it says here. It says that my sister Marcia Crissup, who retyped it all on a computer. Is that the Apple computer that you were talking about?
I don't remember. I mean, I know Marcia, of course, she's my aunt, but I can't remember if it was the very first version was typed by Marcia or my mom, but I know at some point my mother, we did finally buy a PC so that she could actually do the work herself.
Oh, wow. Well, I'm looking at this, and it's absolutely right. There's not just pictures and maps in this. There's a huge amount of description and writing, as well as looks like evolution of language charts. You have talk about vegetation and climate and landforms. I mean, this must have taken so much work.
So this is the difference between a map and an atlas. So when you make a map from scratch, if the data or if the information already exists, then a cartographer can kind of do everything. But in the case of an atlas, it's much more of a broader thing. You have to be able to make the maps, but you also have to accumulate all the knowledge that's needed to make a description. And so that's really the act of a geographer, that means to write the world. That's what that word means. And so people who make atlases, production atlases, have to be trained very broadly. They have to know, okay, it's not just give me some data, I'm going to make a map, but how do I tell a story about a place or a set of places? And in order to do that, in my mother's case, in the case of Tolkien, who was not alive at that time, he had died a few years earlier, really the main thing that she had to do was literally line by line to go through every single book and to note whether or not it contained geographic information. And that line by line information was then basically typed into, well, I guess today we would have a spreadsheet, and that way she could index and compare, and to be able to take that knowledge and say, all right, in this part of the book it said it took this long to get from A to B, and this part of the book it said it was done in this such and such a way, and eventually thousands of lines later you begin to have the background necessary in order to build a map. You're lucky in the case of Tolkien that there was certain maps to start with, but they're very they're of the whole world, or at least to some degree, but they don't contain a lot of detail, or the detail is one part but not another. You can't just rely on the existing maps. You have to be able to build it up directly from text. And that was the single hardest part about building the atlas, is that because she wasn't able to work with the author directly, she had to build a base map upon which everything else was made, and that had to be built just from the text. A text which, by the way, is not completely consistent.
No, that's absolutely right. And so when she created these maps, did they need to be, I mean, they must have needed to be signed off on by someone from the Tolkien estate.
I don't think so. She worked pretty specifically with Houghton Mifflin, and there was, maybe I'm wrong, but my memory is that there was very little interaction with the Tolkien estate. I know Christopher Tolkien, after it was published, was complimentary, and of course, in the following years, there were books that were published, the history series, which occasionally had things which were at odds with
Sure.
some of the things that had been published, which is why there was a revised version to try to take care of some of the more egregious of those errors. But I don't remember a lot of interaction. In fact, my mother once said that she could have been on a desert island. It was really just her and the books and her drafting table. She did use Robert Foster's Complete Guide to Middle-earth quite a bit.
Right.
But she did not, it was not a group effort.
No. Well, let me ask you about, while I have the book out here, let me ask you about one more little blurb in here. And this is of course, the dedication. Let me read this for the listener. It says, to Todd, Mark, that's you, and Christy, still pilous, who have shared 10 years of trials and triumphs from Middle-earth. Can you tell us, what does that mean, still pilous?
That's my mother's joke, meaning that she worried that when she was, during the 2.5 years that she was working on the Atlas, that she wasn't doing her motherly duties of making pies, and which I don't think was entirely true.
It sounds like she did most of the work at night, so I think she did fine. Well, I noticed in doing some research about your mother, I'm sorry to say that I never got to meet her or talk to her, but she had done some really, from what I can tell, some really interesting other atlases around Forgotten Realms and Dragonlance. Is that correct?
Yes, especially during the 1980s. The second one that she did was the Atlas of Pern. This is with Anne McCaffrey. And in the case of Anne McCaffrey, she was, of course, still alive. And I went with my mother to Ireland in the early 1980s. So this would have been just after the original Lord of the Rings Atlas came out, Middle-earth Atlas. And so we went to Ireland. My mother worked with Anne McCaffrey for several days, and that's an entirely different process when you have the author actually there. You can ask questions of.
Wow.
And when we were in Ireland, and also we went to England, my mother went and also looked and studied castles and other sort of medieval designs, because I think she sort of knew that if she was going to do more cartography, it was going to be in this sort of fantasy realm. So she was interested in the architecture of castles and of cathedrals, and so she did the Atlas of Pern. She also did the Atlas of the Land, which is Stephen Donaldson, who at the time lived in Santa Fe, if I remember. My family went and drove down there so she could work with him. And I didn't meet him. I think he would only work with her. In the following year, she did a couple of books that were related to Dungeons and Dragons. She also did a lot of modules for TSR, the company that did Dungeons and Dragons. There were 2 or 3 books that I think she really wanted to do, atlases she wanted to do, that she was not able to. She was very interested in doing a Narnia atlas.
Oh, yes.
The C.S. Lewis estate. And in fact, in the last 2 or 3 years of her life, she was trying to get permission from the Lewis estate to do Narnia, and they pretty much said no. Also, I think she had interest, although she did some preliminary maps for a Narnia atlas. I still have them. I can't show them because it's all copyright, of course.
Sure.
I had interest in a couple of others. I think she would have been interested to do Earthsea, Ursula Le Guin's Earthsea.
Of course.
She was very interested in Dune, Frank Herbert's Dune. The weird thing is that I live in Eugene, Oregon, and I didn't really realize that Frank Herbert was in the Oregon Dunes National Recreational Area when he came up with his book idea, which is just 40 miles away from where I live.
Oh, wow.
So it's in some strange way I've been connected, and my mother was connected with a lot of fantasy writers, and Dungeons and Dragons, for example, was published by TSR, which also was in southern Wisconsin. At that time, Lake Geneva. So we were very much at the heart of a lot of this. In fact, Tolkien, in some respects, was the furthest away in the UK.
Sure. Well, I'm just going to ask it because it came up. Did you or your mother ever get into Dungeons and Dragons or play just to sort of experience it?
I played it as a kid.
Yeah.
I don't think she ever played it, but she was very much. She talked with a lot of people who did, because she needed to know how to draw maps for modules that were being used in those games. It was different than doing an atlas. And I can't remember how many, I know she did a handful of those atlases, but at the time, that was a big thing, Dungeons and Dragons, and if she had been a full-time cartographer, which she really never was, she either was doing atlases or she was doing physical therapy or she was occasionally doing side teaching at the university. But if she had done it more full-time, I think that would have been the direction she would have had to have gone, more of a short-term contract cartographer.
I'm curious about the release of the movies, and if you know, in the early 2000s, all the way up to a few years ago, and the talk of this Amazon series that's coming out, have people tried to contact you, or have there's been like a resurgence in interest in the Atlas of Middle-earth?
So I'll start with the end of your question first, which is the new Amazon series. I have deliberately not looked at it. I looked into it. I'm trying to stay away from it as much as possible. And to my knowledge, nobody's come knocking on the door. I know that the Atlas was used a great deal in the development of the movies, the Lord of the Ring movies. I know this because Alan Lee, who was one of the main artists on the movies, was at a couple of events with my mother late in her life, in the last year or two, and he was very involved in the production of the Lord of the Rings movies, and he said, we use your atlas all the time. So from that perspective, it was a big deal even before the movies came out that her work was being used, and there was definitely, even before the movies came out, her books sold much more than average. And I think perhaps a little bit during the Hobbit movies as well. But I've always been surprised that there's been a kind of general, stable amount of sales ever since they were published. And it hasn't gone in the, except for the Lord of the Rings movies, there hasn't been some kind of like roller coaster. It's been a much more consistent sort of selling book than you would expect. Normally these kind of things go in cycles, and I think her book has been a much more stable kind of book. I think partly that's because it has a reputation for being a resource rather than a thing. It's a thing that people say, oh, you've read those books, now here are a couple of resources. And resources tend to have a longer-term shelf life, even though they don't get the huge sales. Well,
I tell you, they were a resource for me, and I really wish that I had them when I started reading The Lord of the Rings, and especially the Silmarillion. But I definitely used them when I was preparing this campaign, which is what this podcast is about. But I want you to know, I put this out there on Twitter. I said, hey, you know, if anybody has used the Atlas of Middle-earth, you know, kind of chime in and let me know, you know, how you've used it, and a couple people have chimed in, and they, you know, they just like me, really all the way from this formed the basis of my own map work, like so somebody that's in cartography, to the, you know, I got this as a Christmas present, and it's one of my favorite books. So I just wanted you to know that you know, there are people out there that this book has had a huge impact on, including myself.
I appreciate that. I'm sure my mother would as well.
I'm kind of nearing the end of my questions for you, but I guess my last question for you would be, if your mother could be here with us tonight, is there anything that she would want to pass on to the fans of her work? Anything that she would want to say?
Oh, that's almost too big of a question, and I'm not sure I'm qualified to answer. I'm sure she would say that maps, no matter what they're for, are a great entryway into worlds. And in the case of Tolkien's books, this is an enormous world. Use the maps for your enjoyment, and some people go further than that and are interested in maps themselves, and there are a lot of worlds to be mapped.
There sure are. Well, Mark, thank you so much. I don't know if there's anything that maybe I didn't ask you about that you wanted to mention. So I'll just open that up before I say goodbye. Is there anything that you want to say?
No, I don't think so. I wish your listeners well, and I very much appreciate being able to talk about my mother's work. Thank you.
Thank you so much.